The new River Subdivision out of Hinton doesn't wait. Eastbound, Hinton, West Virginia, the track climbs for 80 miles through Appalachian ridgelines before topping out at Alleghany, Virginia, 2,072 feet above sea level. 13 of those 80 miles hold a steady 0.577% grade. It doesn't look like much on paper. The loaded hoppers know differently. On a December morning in 1941, a coal consist is moving east out of Hinton before dawn. 140 loaded hoppers, and each car carrying 70 tons of West Virginia coal destined for the Tidewater docks at Newport News. The consist weight, roughly 11,000 tons. At the front of this train working the grade at a hard exhaust beat, a locomotive the railroad calls the Alleghany. Class H-8, built in Lima, Ohio. Delivered to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway that month. It weighs 771,300 pounds without water in the boiler. Its 4 cylinders, each 22.5 inches in diameter, each with a 33-inch stroke, are driving 6 pairs of 67-inch box-pock wheels against the rail. At the rear of the same consist, a second Alleghany shoving, 2 locomotives, 140 loaded hoppers, a mountain between Hinton and the coast. Neither engineer called for a helper out of the yard. They didn't need one. The Chesapeake and Ohio had just taken delivery of the most powerful steam locomotive ever built. Not the most powerful in the country, in the world. And almost nobody then or now knows its name. To understand what the C&O built, you have to understand what the C&O carried. The Chesapeake and Ohio was a coal road. Not incidental, fundamental. The entire railroad existed to move coal from the fields of West Virginia and Kentucky to Tidewater at Newport News and to the industrial customers of Ohio and Michigan. By 1939, the road was running 40 Lima-built 210-4 T1 class locomotives across the level Ohio territory and 45 882 H-7 class articulateds on the mountain grades of West Virginia and Virginia. The H-7s dated from the early 1920s. Then by the late 1930s, they were showing their age on the hard mountain miles. The 80-mile run from Hinton East to Clifton Forge was the critical grade. 13 of those miles climbed at 0.577% to the summit at Alleghany, Virginia. The H-7S could work it, but slowly and not without helpers on anything close to a full consist. Lima Locomotive Works out of Lima, Ohio, had been watching the Norfolk and Western succeed with their home-built Class A 2664. About Lima's engineers had a different solution. A 6-couple articulated with a 6-wheel trailing truck large enough to support a firebox, unlike anything in the American railroad network. 9 feet wide, 15 feet long. A great area of 135 square feet. In 1940, C&O authorized the first order. 10 locomotives. Class H-8. The nickname came from the mountains they were built to conquer. Before we go further, if this kind of railroad history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around real American locomotives, real engineering decisions, and the real stories behind the iron highways that connected this country. If that's the kind of history worth preserving to you, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you work the railroads as an engineer, a fireman, a conductor, a machinist, a dispatcher? Did a father or grandfather spend their career on the high iron? Did you grow up in a railroad town? Cheyenne, Altoona, Sparks, Topeka, Collinwood? Well, leave it in the comments. The people who actually worked these locomotives and these routes know things no archive has ever recorded. We want to hear from them. Now, back to the locomotive. The H-8 that came out of Lima's erecting shop in December 1941 was something the railroad industry had not seen before. 2666 in white notation. 2 leading wheels. 2 sets of 6 driving wheels on an articulated frame. 6 trailing wheels beneath the firebox. The firebox was the key. 9 feet wide, 15 feet long. A great area of 135 square feet, larger than the floor plan of a small house, consuming coal at 7 to 8 tons per hour when running hard. At the standard stoker company type MB automatic stoker fed coal continuously from the tender. No fireman could shovel fast enough to keep a firebox this size burning. The stoker did it mechanically, around the clock. 4 cylinders, 2 on each engine unit, measured 22.5 inches in diameter with a 33-inch stroke. Boiler pressure at 260 pounds per square inch. Baker valve gear. You have the 67-inch box-pock driving wheels gave the locomotive enough speed to run at 45 miles per hour on level territory and still produce full power on a climb. The calculated starting tractive effort, 110,200 pounds. Then, the dynamometer car climb. Testing on the new River Subdivision produced a reading no steam locomotive before or since has exceeded 7,498 horsepower at the drawbar. Sustained output between 40 and 50 miles per hour held between 6,700 and 6,900 horsepower. On the big boy, Union Pacific's celebrated 4884 produced around 6,200 drawbar horsepower in the same era. The Alleghany was not in the same conversation. It was in a different class. The tender alone was an engineering decision. The C&O needed maximum capacity within the limits of existing turntable length. Lima's solution, a tender built wider at the rear than the front, biasing weight toward the back axles, 25,000 gallons of water, 25 tons of coal. The locomotive with tender weighed approximately 1.2 million pounds. The heaviest axle load of any American steam locomotive, roughly 84,000 pounds per axle. Something is about to complicate that number, but it won't surface until the first locomotives are already on property. The Alleghenies went to work on the new river and Alleghany subdivisions immediately. Standard practice on the Hinton to Clifton Forge run was paired working. One H-8 on the head end, one H-8 on the rear. Together, they moved 11,500-ton coal trains out of Hinton, ran at a brisk 45 miles per hour on the level track to Ronsverde, then dropped to 20 miles per hour as the grade steepened toward the summit. 80 miles. One run. No helpers called from a siding. The H-7s that the Alleghenies replaced had made the same run in roughly twice the time. While where the grade reached Alleghany, the pusher locomotive cut off. A 125-foot turntable at the summit turned it for the return. The road locomotive continued west to Clifton Forge, where it was cut off, serviced, and dispatched on a westbound train. East of Clifton Forge, two 84K4 class locomotives took the Consist down the mostly downhill run along the James River toward Richmond. The Alleghenies also handled westbound coal trains from West Virginia into Ohio, supplementing the T1 class on the level territory between Russell, Kentucky, and Columbus. And it was steadier work, less grade, more distance, and the H-8 67-inch drivers handled the different service without strain. Then, December 1941 became 1942. The United States was at war. The C&O was a coal road that ran through the industrial and mining heart of the eastern United States. Every coal car that moved, every troop train that had to run on schedule, every priority freight that could not be delayed, all of it went over the same grades the Alleghenies were built to work. By the peak war years, these locomotives were running with minimal recovery time between assignments. The railroad pushed them because the railroad had to. 23 of the 60 H-8s had been equipped with steam heat and signal lines for passenger service. They pulled troop trains, hospital trains, and priority mail. The grade didn't change because there was a war on. Neither did the schedule. The H-8 was designed to haul 5,000 tons at 45 miles per hour. That was the engineering brief, a high-speed, heavy-tonnage locomotive that would run coal trains fast and make the grades without helpers. The C&O ran them at 10,000 tons, sometimes more, at 15 miles per hour. The economics were not irrational. If you have a machine producing this much power, load it to maximum tonnage. Move more coal per locomotive. The problem is that the dynamometer car had recorded its peak numbers at 45 miles per hour. And at 15, the H-8 was operating well below the speed range where its horsepower peaked. The railroad was paying for 7,498 horsepower and using a fraction of it. The design was wasted on the service it was given, not because the locomotives were inadequate, but because the C&O never used them the way Lima built them to run. The weight problem arrived before the misuse question. While the first 10 H-8s were still being delivered in late 1941, Lima's miscalculation surfaced, and the locomotives weighed 771,300 pounds, thousands of pounds heavier than Lima had originally represented to the C&O. The railroad's maintenance crews caught the discrepancy when they reweighed the locomotives on property. The train crews, whose pay was calculated in part based on locomotive weight on driving wheels, had been underpaid from the first run. The C&O made up the difference from their own account, then went after Lima. In 1944, the railroad filed suit against Lima Locomotive Works for over $3 million. The weight overrun had also forced a costly bridge inspection program across the C&O system. The penalties in the contract were real. Lima paid them. Then, on June 9, 1953, locomotive number 1642 exploded at Hinton. A crown sheet failure. The boiler, driven by a prolonged low water condition, failed catastrophically. The force of the explosion rocketed the boiler off the running gear toward the rear. All 3 crew members were killed. Engineer Wilbur H. Anderson of Hinton was among them. According to his family, and previous crews had reported a faulty water level gauge on 1642. The C&O paid Anderson's widow, Georgia, $10,000 in compensation. The locomotive was not rebuilt. By June 1953, the class was already entering retirement. The first H-8s began leaving service in 1952. By 1956, all 60 Alleghenies were retired. The decision was not complicated. Electromotive had spent the late 1940s proving that diesel-electric units could be coupled in multiple unit lash-ups to produce whatever horsepower a railroad required, and that they required far less labor, far less infrastructure, and far fewer maintenance hours than a steam locomotive of this complexity. The Alleghany demanded a skilled roundhouse crew for every servicing cycle. The 135-square-foot firebox alone required inspection and attention after every run. The stoker mechanism, the Baker valve gear, the boiler. Each system carried maintenance costs that added up over tens of thousands of miles. And the 84,000-pound axle load was not getting cheaper to manage. It restricted the locomotive to lines with reinforced track and rated bridges, limiting its flexibility across the system. By 1952, C&O management had run the numbers. The EMDF units could handle the work. Thus, the comparison to the big boy is worth stating plainly. Union Pacific built 25 big boys between 1941 and 1944. They retired them in 1962. 8 survive today. 1 runs under steam. The UP had the instinct, or the foresight, to hold back examples for preservation before the scrapper came. C&O built 60 Alleghenies, more powerful than any big boy the dynamometer car ever measured. Not one of the 60 was preserved by the railroad. 58 were cut apart for scrap. Thus, the price the C&O had paid, an average approaching $300,000 per locomotive, with the final order running nearly $400,000 each, came back as scrap tonnage. 60 built. 2 survived. The rest were scrapped for pennies on the dollar. 2 Alleghenies remain. Number 1601 was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it has been on display indoors since 1956. It took 3 attempts to move it into the building. Number 1604 eventually reached the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke, Virginia, where it has stood outdoors through decades of weather, and survived a 1985 flood that washed the ground out from under it and nearly tipped it over. The Alleghany never had a champion the way the big boy did. Union Pacific named the 4000 class, promoted it, and turned it into an icon before the last one finished its final run. The C&O's attitude toward the H-8 was functional. It was a tool. A very large, very expensive, very powerful tool. When it was no longer the most cost-efficient tool available, the road disposed of it with the same matter-of-fact efficiency it had always applied to the coal business. No operational Alleghany survives. No restoration is underway. The dynamometer car number, 7,498 horsepower, while recorded on the new River Subdivision, has never been exceeded by any reciprocating steam locomotive in recorded history. It sits in the C&O's technical records, quietly, next to the name of a machine that almost nobody outside serious railroad history remembers. The grade out of Hinton is still there. CSX trains work it now. Distributed power, multiple diesel units, the technology of a different era applied to the same mountain. The machines changed. The mountain did not. And somewhere on that grade, in the sound of a heavy freight at full throttle against the Appalachian rock, something carries from 1941, a power that was never equaled, a name almost nobody knows. If this is the kind of railroad history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. There are more locomotives, more forgotten experiments, More untold stories and from the steam and diesel era still to document. And if you have a connection to what you just heard, a grandfather who ran one of these engines, a father who worked the roundhouse, and someone who was on the footplate when this era was still running, tell us in the comments. What did they operate? Which road? Which run? The men who drove these locomotives didn't leave many records behind, but the people who knew them are still here. We want to hear from them.